I'm Chloe.
And I'm Bez.
And this podcast is for graduate teachers in their first 5 years.
We share our own teaching stories as well as advice and ideas we wish we'd had as graduate teachers.
Sometimes funny, sometimes horrifying, but always true.
We want you to thrive and love teaching beyond the dreaded 5-year cliff. Hey everyone. For those new to the podcast, I'm Bez, and one of the ways I used to deal with stress as a teacher was sit in my car after school and cry. Here's my co-host, Chloe. Tell us a bit about yourself.
Thanks, Bez, for the warm welcome. Math science teacher, completely overworked myself through being a STEM leader and producing school musicals, and did a lot of that in my first year of teaching. So,
don't love that for you.
Yeah, my coping mechanism was like not eating during the day and then stress eating at night.
Very real, very honest. So, Chloe, I've got a confession today.
Okay, go on.
During my time as a teacher, and even now sometimes, I get confused between formative and summative assessment tasks.
Oh, girlfriend, you're not the only one.
In both of my schools that I taught at, the amount of times I would have a conversation while we're planning assessments and I would so confidently talk about summative assessments, and then my colleague would be like, we're not planning a formative, see, I'm still getting confused. We're not planning a summative assessment, we're talking about formative assessments.
So were people just looking at you with like question marks in their eyes, like, what is this girl talking about?
Yes, and so many times to avoid that, I would just be like, so this assessment task we're planning for, and just not mention formative or summative. Yeah, and hope that no one would catch on.
That's called lying by omission.
Were you ever confused about formative and summative assessment tasks?
Yeah, I was definitely confused by this a lot. I mean, they sound really similar to start with, but also they're kind of big words and there's a lot of language to learn when you're starting out, right?
Very true.
But I was a pretty big fan of like getting on the formative assessment bandwagon. And I remember in my first year, I was like, oh, I'm going to like do this formative assessment thing and I'm totally going to nail it. So I'd like planned this elaborate lesson with like, and I'll say a very ambitious lesson with a year 9 maths class, not the time to start to plan ambitious lessons. And I was like, yeah, I'm going to go in and I'm going to do like this pre-testing quiz thing. And then we're going to do like this whole lesson and a series of activities. And then we're going to come back and do a review at the end. And then I'll get them to sit the quiz at the end of the lesson as well. And then I'll be able to see their learning progression. So I was all like, yeah, this whole formative assessment thing. So I like went in, I was like super pumped. I'd like started the lesson with the kids. They got on to their pre-test. And that took like 45 minutes. Like most of the lesson was gone.
I'm just laughing because isn't that a classic story?
Yeah, I know.
It's meant to be a 10-minute task and then it turns into the whole lesson and you're like, oh no, now I only have 10 minutes left of class.
All right. And I'd gone in thinking, oh yeah, this is just going to take them like 10 minutes of the lesson. And it took like the entire lesson. So as this is playing out in front of me, not how as I had planned, a whole series of expletives are going off in my head. And I'm thinking about, well, how am I going to do this next? And how do people even do formative assessment? Is it like, why is it this difficult? And then I was also thinking about all of the marking that I was going to have to do with this series of pages of a pre-test that I'd done that I was going to need to mark very quickly if I was going to get them to sit the next one again. But I hadn't even done the teaching part yet.
So you could probably guess by now that we're going to be chatting about formative assessment tasks today. Mm-hmm. I think a great question to start with, Chloe, is what is the difference between a formative and a summative assessment task?
So formative assessment is, I like to think of it as assessment for teaching.
That's a good way to remember it.
I know, I like that one too. And so it's using some sort of quick diagnostic tool to assess where your students are at a point in time so that you can do something about it. Whereas summative assessments are designed to be done post-learning. So it's an assessment of learning rather than for learning. So I like to think sum is like the end.
Yeah.
But pretty tricky to remember. So do you have any like tips on like how to remember the difference between these two things for our listeners? Like formative, summative, they're both assessments. How do you remember?
My confession was I used to get very confused, but My way of remembering it was summative is the sum of all parts of the learning. That was my only one. I didn't have one for formative assessment, and that's probably why I always got confused between formative and summative.
Yeah.
But I just remember summative, the sum of all things.
I used to think the exact same thing. But for formative, I did have one. So I just made it up, though. It's like not an actual thing. But hey, if it works, like it works, right? So formative, I would be like, they're forming, they're learning.
That's a good one.
So it's still part of the process,
I
right?
like that one.
Yeah.
That's a handy one.
Or just form and for learning. Like it all, I don't know, it all sounds the same to me.
Forming for learning.
Forming for learning the form.
Yeah. So, Chloe, I think a really important question to answer is why on earth would you do formative assessment tasks, particularly since it does add to the marking and the workload as a teacher?
Yeah, absolutely. And I think it's interesting that you raise that because I remember when we were probably students, formative assessment didn't happen very often. Mm-hmm. So, coming into this sort of, I'm going to call it the new world of teaching, but it's really just this formative assessment world of teaching or continuous assessment world. We're doing this all the time and it's not something we grew up with. So, yeah, important. Why are we doing this? I think historically, the way that we used to assess things was to just do a bunch of learning, do a bunch of activities, and then be like, okay, cool, let's do some sort of formal assessment and move on. We've ticked the box. Nowadays, we're much more involved in the process of learning and trying to pick up on, okay, where are student struggles, where are student strengths, so that we can sort of change the learning plan as we go. So formative assessment is there as a diagnostic tool, as you know. It's meant to be done regularly, consistently, and it's not meant to be like a big onerous task. And it's meant to be super helpful.
I mean, it would have been helpful when I was in high school because I remember learning a topic and being like, yep, I've got this. And then you get an assessment back. And of course, it's the summative assessment. And you're like, oh, well, I completely flunked that and I thought I had it.
Yeah.
And I think part of like what you're saying is you can really encourage students to check in to see how they're going during the journey. And it encourages them to sort of pick up different tools and strategies to use to know that learning is a process and it's not just this one assessment and that's it, right?
You're not working towards one thing and that's it. It's interesting though because, I've just spoken about this from the teacher's perspective and it's really useful for teachers because it gives us all this data for our students. But I think it's important that you've highlighted that this isn't just for teachers. This is also for our students. It's a point for them to check in and diagnose their own progress. And I think that helps to build more reflective learners in the long run. Ideally, if you're doing formative assessment right, you're not going to end up with bucket loads extra marking like, little new teacher Chloe who thought it was a great idea to have a 4-page pre-test. Like, what was I thinking? So I think now it's a great opportunity for us to talk about, well, what are some really good activities that work well as formative tasks?
Have you got a few in your bank?
I definitely do.
Okay.
But again, I think a lot of these are probably going to be specific to certain subjects, but there are some that are pretty universal.
Yeah.
So my favourite one is actually something called a POE. We love an acronym in teaching, don't we? Don't call it a POE because that's just weird. But it stands for Predict, Observe, Explain. Have you done these before?
Yes.
Oh,
love them in science.
Love a POE. We use them in science a lot, but that's not to say that you couldn't use it in like an English classroom or in an analysis style task for history or something like that. And it is what it is. Usually you have an image or some sort of prompt or a piece of text. I like using images, particularly with the younger students, and they've got to predict what's happening. You can do it with like an experiment as well, like do a demonstration. They make their observations of what's happening and then they have to explain what's going on. I love that because it helps them understand the difference between an observation and an inference. And I think so many times, like particularly junior students and sometimes senior students as well, they think that they're making observations, but they're actually making inferences.
Yes.
And it helps to draw that distinction. So that's why I really like that one.
That's
what
a
about
great
you?
one for science. When I first taught VCE, and I taught bio across 3-4 years.
Yep.
I started doing like weekly quizzes. For those who teach bio, like you would know, and for those who don't teach bio actually, is like very content heavy. So students can sort of get lost in the content pretty quickly before you finish an area of study. So having like a weekly or a fortnightly multiple choice quiz, and it would just be 10 questions, multiple choice. I did that because it was easy to mark. I would have just the answers beforehand and you just tick it off or cross it. And it was just a really great way for students to check in and for me to check in as well, but to see where they were at for those 2 weeks or for that 1 week of learning that we did. And then over time, actually, I used to do that with pen and paper, and I always did it under like assessment conditions. So, I would do, if it's 10 multiple choice questions, a minute a mark.
Yep.
So they'd have 10 minutes to do that.
Replicate those exam style conditions, yeah.
Exactly. And then over time, I actually started giving them like 3 minutes of reading time because I think it's also important that they know what to do in reading time. You're not just
through it.
Exactly. And then that developed to, instead of pen and paper, I actually started doing it on a Google form. And getting students to do it on a Google form meant that on Google form you can put the answer in. Right? So it
Clever gal.
automatically marks it for you. So wham, bam, done.
Yep. Perfect.
A bit of prep work, but I found that that was really effective and students got immediate feedback as well.
Yeah.
And then after doing that formative assessment task, part of the conversation would be going through, because as a teacher, when you get that form back, you can see if there's a particular question that the whole class struggled on.
Yeah.
And so using that formative assessment, I'd start the next class by picking out one question that
And then you could
most of
recap
the
it.
students got incorrect.
Question, because this is a VCE class and like the depth of knowledge required to meet the course requirements is obviously very different to, what's in junior 7 to 10 classes. How would you select the multiple choice questions? Because I'm just thinking when students complete exams, they're not just completing multiple choice, they're completing short answer as well. So how did you make sure that the level of difficulty was right?
Great question. I actually pulled all of the questions from previous VCA exams, and the reason why
so you use past exam questions.
Yeah, and the reason why I did that is I think it's important for students to be aware of the sort of questions that they're getting at the end of the year exam or even for like a SAC, and not to be shocked when they sit in assessment and go, we haven't learnt this, or like panic and be like, what is this question asking me?
Yeah.
So the more that you expose them to that sort of style of question, the more comfortable and confident they become with doing that. So I literally just pulled it out of previous exams. The way I would order it is using Bloom's taxonomy. So I'd always start with questions that were relatively easy and accessible. So that, like the remember, understand, sort of like the identify.
Scaffold it? Like by the time they got to question 10, that was going to be the trickiest question?
Yes, absolutely. And I think that's a good point that you make there. I think that's really important for formative assessment tasks to, go from like identify, understand, and so on, and then by the time they get to the last question,
evaluating and creating and things later on. Yeah,
that's very important.
Cool.
Yeah,
I like that one. Quizzes are pretty staple, and I guess if you wanted to make it super fun, you could make them do a Kahoot. Everyone loves that.
Oh, yeah, and that's a great
Along
way
to
to.
the Kahoot music. Dun 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 dun. No, anyone?
That brings back memories.
All right. Well, apart from quizzes, what other things are we using? We got POEs, we got quizzes.
To be honest, my go-to was a quiz, but when I started doing psych, I actually changed it so that it wasn't only multiple choice, it was also short answer questions. But again, I would only cap it at 10 marks because you don't want students sitting there for 20 minutes. Or for it to be like this huge task. So my psychology students actually started asking me to put in short answer questions or multiple choice questions. Another really good one, actually, is for VC students, a really common pain point for them is answering short answer questions. So what you could even do is I used to pull out previous exam questions and say, for example, it might be a 3-marker.
Yep.
And that would be my formative assessment. I'd pull a question that has either like a scenario or data, some sort of application question in there for them, where they have to like synthesize the information and then answer it. But I was a big fan of just pulling questions out from previous exams throughout the course work.
Yeah. I think that's really important for seniors, and like I think there's something to be said of like helping them to build their responses as well. And I know that often we do that throughout the teaching process, and we a bit of a process of gradual release. I do, we do, you do. But sample responses can be really handy. So you can also flip that concept. Instead of getting them to create their own response, give them the question with a series of different responses and get them to decide or have a class discussion or independently decide however you want to do it. Which one do you think addresses the criteria best and why? I used to do that with my juniors as well. Like you can scale that up and, as you said, scaffold them through that process. And they get quite opinionated.
They do.
I quite like that.
And they're quite harsh too. It's just like, oh, wow.
I wish you were this harsh when you were marking your own work. Unfortunately not.
So you use that for junior science?
Yeah, I did use that for junior. And then sometimes if I was still getting them to create their own responses, we could make it collaborative and like instead of me formatively assessing the class, get them to do a bit of peer assessment.
Okay.
And then I could collect the responses back. So it adds that layer of reflection and deepens their thinking a little bit.
Yeah.
But I know students need a little bit of guidance when it comes to giving peer feedback because, particularly juniors, but I've seen like year 10s and 11s do this as well. You ask them to peer assess something and if that's the only direction you give them, they're just going to look at something and write good, nice answer, not long enough.
So how do you scaffold them then? Like what were some things that you put in place so that they're actually providing constructive feedback?
So you could talk them through something like a feedback sandwich.
Okay.
And there's like my favourite acronym that I like to use, the TAG protocol. I know I talk about all the time. Again, love an acronym.
For those who don't know.
The T is for tell a positive, so something that is good about what they've done. The A is to ask a question about something in their writing, and then the G is to give a suggestion. So that gives them 3 really distinct things that they need to do when they're looking through that response, rather than this is good, because I can't stand it when you see those bits of feedback.
And good was a very common vocabulary that was used in peer.
Who likes the word
feedback?
Good? Yeah. But also, I think there are other students who are like very driven and very motivated, and they could get someone else's work and just like rip it to shreds and like completely destroy somebody's confidence. So it just, guides them to a little bit of like, that feedback sandwich. And
gives them a bit of structure.
Yeah, a bit of structure.
Yeah.
I mean, you're not ending on a positive, but like you're not being completely negative and you're not just telling someone they're amazing and they're God and their answers are the be-all and all. So the final thing we want to talk about then is how to make sure that your assessments aren't too long and then what your next steps are with your formative assessments. So we've spoken a lot about sort of these pen and paper ideas and things that you can do to collect lots of data. Are there some quick formative assessments that you've used before that maybe don't require you to take some paperwork home?
And we love not taking paperwork home because sometimes they just like to see our home and then end up back at school.
Or they sit in the car.
Don't even make it out of the car. There's a couple that come to mind. I was always a big fan of like thumbs up, thumbs down.
Yep.
Or an in-between. And that works really well if you've got like the explicit learning intention success criteria
To
up there
refer
for
back
the
to.
students. Yep.
You can do that in the middle of a lesson too. It doesn't have to be at the end.
Exactly. Really good point. It doesn't have to be at the end of a lesson when you're doing a formative assessment. Popping up a multiple choice question. And for Year 7 students, what I used to do was at the start of the year, I'd get them to fold an A4 piece of paper in half and just write A, B, C, D in each one. They keep it in their pencil case, and then you just pop up a multiple choice question. They pick the answer. I always told the class, like, close your eyes, I want you to pop it up. It's low stakes for students, particularly when they're junior students and they're a bit nervous.
And I suppose if you want to be like completely high maintenance with that same idea, you could laminate some cards for your students and put them on little like key ring holders, and you could have a class set that you take from class to class. But that's if you love laminating things.
I did not.
Otherwise, if you're like a very low-key person and you're like, paper's not my style, you can actually just teach your students sign language. I used to do like sign language A, B, C, D for multi-choice.
Cool.
They really like that too. And they get to learn a little bit of Auslan. And again, you're getting that real visual guide of where your class is at, where you might need to slow down, where you might need to speed up, who you might need to check in with one-on-one, who might need some small group work intervention. And I think that's the whole point of this. It's all about the next steps. What are you going to do with that information? There's absolutely no point doing formative assessments if you're not going to do anything with that data.
100%. And confession, at the start when I was teaching, I'd get so excited about doing formative assessments, but then I'd just like mark it and then like forget about it, and then we're moving on to the next thing.
Yeah.
And that's a very valid point. You have to be using the data or what you're getting from those formative assessments and inform your next lesson.
And being careful that you don't overload yourself. I remember in my first couple of years, maybe it was like my second or third year teaching, I went on this blitz where I was like, I'm going to do all these entry cards all the time. But I never had time to look at them during the lesson. So I ended up with just these stacks of entry cards that used to sit on my desk. And I never got a chance to do anything with them. So I was really just wasting my time. Like, sure, my students were thinking about things, but I didn't know where they were at. So what was the point?
Yeah. And then you've just spent a lot of time on that formative assessment and it actually hasn't informed the next piece of learning. The takeaway then, what's one tip that you would give for people to actually use their data in the next lesson to inform teaching?
Yeah. I think a couple of main things. Plan to have formative assessments that are both written and maybe visual, like non-written, so that you're collecting multiple points of data throughout your lesson, so that, if you are in a situation where for whatever reason you can't use one set, maybe that entry card took you too long to get to, whatever, things happen, then you've got something else that you can base your judgments on. And just plan it out. Eventually you get to a point where you get really good at doing things on the fly and you don't need to plan things, but in the beginning, to get yourself into that rhythm, into that habit, really try to think strategically about what you're going to do and when, and what works with your students.
Love that. And can confirm it does get better.
Awesome. What about you, Bez?
Mine would just be, once you do the formative assessment task, pick 2 points of feedback. Like, don't try to do too much in the next lesson and do it at the start of the lesson. And that's part of like building routines with students as well.
Come back to it regularly.
Yeah, and you're sort of closing that feedback loop. But like 2 things I'd pick from the formative assessment task is one thing that they did really well. It's important to give positive feedback to students. And then you can just say one challenge of the class and unpack that together in groups or a class.
And eventually your students will really look forward to formative assessments.
Yay!
Thanks for listening today, everyone. If you would like to formatively assess our podcast, then please rate us on Apple or Spotify.
Formative? Wait, isn't that summative? No, I'm joking. Summative is the sum of all things, and forming of learning.
I guess it depends if we decide to do anything with that information, hey?